Hello ladies and gentlemen, Coldar here. Today we are looking at Heroic Protectors of the Endless in Terrace of Endless Spring. So for us, this encounter proved to be the most difficult heroic that we've done so far, with 14 out of 16 complete at the time of this recording. That kind of tells you something about the encounter. At least for us, we found it to be kind of annoying. I think it took a little over 60 attempts to get our first kill on this. So take that as you will, but the difficulty of the encounter does vary quite a bit on your raid composition, and a great deal as well on your raid's overall DPS. This is really a damage central fight. So if your raid can output strong DPS, especially on-demand burst DPS, you will find this encounter to be a lot easier. If you have trouble with that, then it's going to be a bitch, because the longer the fight goes, the more ads you'll get, and the more ads you get, the more DPS you need to kill those ads, which means the less damage on the boss, which means more time spent killing the boss, which means more damage to the raid and healing required, yada yada. So it all snowballs very quickly if you can't do enough damage to keep up. Anyway, for raid composition, we decided to use 1 tank and 2 healers, after trying a variety of setups, and I think I can confidently say that's the best way to do it. The single tank is not really a problem. You will notice a little bit of spike damage on 1 tank during mostly the first phase and possibly the second phase, depending on how you handle it. But it's not severe, and it's definitely worth it, because that tank will do a lot more DPS. Significantly more than just about everyone in the raid until the end. And the other tank can then obviously spec into an actual DPS spec and do a good chunk of damage as well. So I think 1 tank is definitely the way to go. Healing is a little bit more up in the air as far as what will work for you. But we tried 2 healers and 3 healers, and 2 just seems a better option. The problem with 3 healers is meeting the DPS requirement in the final phase, and we'll get into that in detail when we get to that section. But suffice to say, the longer that phase goes, the crazier the damage gets on the raid, and at a certain point, more healing doesn't really offer you any stability. So if you can end that phase faster with more DPS, that's probably going to be a better setup for you. Anyway, I think that covers the intro, so let's get into the details and get started with the guide. Now, on Heroic, there's really only one new addition to this encounter, and that is the new ad that will spawn throughout the fight called Minion of Fear. These appear one at a time from the stairway leading up to Lishi's platform, and when they spawn, they start to make their way toward whichever boss is the lowest health at the time, so the one you're attacking. You can see in the top right there, there's a Minion of Fear, and hobbling his way to the boss's, Papa, I'm coming. Poor little guy. So these minions drastically change how you handle this fight, specifically how you assign DPS and how you manage positioning are the key factors. Now, the minions have about 1.2 million health each, and this means that you need to have at least 1 or 2 DPS throughout the fight assigned to killing these minions. If they're allowed to reach melee range of the boss they're currently pursuing, that boss will absorb the minion, getting a stack of Greater Corrupted Essence. This is a stacking buff that increases the damage the boss deals by 10% per stack. And if it's allowed to reach 5 stacks, the boss will explode, dealing 700,000 shadow damage to the entire raid, basically wiping you. So, obviously, even getting 1 or 2 stacks on a boss is not ideal, just because it'll increase their damage dealt. But after 3 minutes, the debuff will go away on its own, or if the boss dies. So it's not the end of the world if 1 or 2 stacks hit the boss, but this means that you're not utilizing that particular minion as you should be. So it's a bad way to go. If you can't kill the minions fast enough and the boss absorbs them, you probably should adjust your strategy to prevent that. Now, the good news is that you can kill the minions before they reach the boss and provide a benefit to the raid. So every time a minion dies, the 2 players nearest to that minion's location when it died will gain a stacking buff called Corrupted Essence. Similar to the buffs on the boss, this will stack up, and this can go up to 10 stacks, and it increases the damage dealt by those players by 10% per stack, and it lasts 2 minutes. If Corrupted Essence reaches 10 stacks on a player, similarly to the boss, the player will explode, but this time they only deal 250,000 shadow damage, and to everyone in 30 yards. So it's not necessarily a wipe if a player reaches 10 stacks, but they do lose their stack count, and therefore they don't get any damage bonus until they get new stacks. So it's far from ideal, and you don't want to allow players to reach 10. So what this means is that the general strategy for utilizing minions is to kill them all, causing 2 buffs to go out every time one dies, and then rotate your raid members closest to the minions so that particular players can get their stacks as close to 9 as possible by the time the fight is over. This will maximize DPS, giving everyone as close to 90% extra damage output as possible, and make the fight easier from there. So actually how you do that is kind of the main theorycraft behind this encounter. There are a few ways to handle distribution of Corrupted Essence stacks, but it all revolves around properly positioning the current pair of players, 2 players, that want to get the next Corrupted Essence stack nearest to the minions when they die. So if you imagine just looking down on the fight here, you have the bosses in the middle of the room, and we'll talk about this later, but this is a good idea, just keep them in the center. And the minions spawning on the stairs off to the right there. So the minion's always going to follow a straight path from its spawn location to reach the boss that you're currently fighting. It wants to get there so bad. Now, when a minion dies, you have players distributed randomly around the room, for example, and in various spots. And when the minion dies, if a circle is extended out from that minion, it just keeps getting bigger and bigger, and you imagine it extending until the edge of that circle touches 1 player. That's the first player that's going to get the debuff. And then the second player that circle touches as it expands will get the second debuff. Therefore, you can set up positions that will allow your raid to ensure that when a minion dies, as long as it's near a designated spot, the 2 players that you want to get that particular Corrupted Essence stack will be the nearest 2 players to that location. And if you repeat this process, it doesn't really matter who's up for their stack as long as you do it properly. The easiest way we found to do this was to mark a designated location for the approximate spot that a minion should die as it's traveling to the bosses. So we had 2 DPS focus on killing minions throughout most of the fight. And then there's a raid marker for the melee position when they're getting Corrupted Essence stacks, indicated by the blue marker. And then a red marker that's out toward the minion spawn, that's sort of the range stacking position when they're getting Corrupted Essence stacks. Now the point is, as long as a minion dies around that red location, if a melee on blue is trying to get Corrupted Essence, they're the closest player, and if a ranged player is on red, they'll be the closest player. And the 2 people that are killing the minions are on either side about max DPS distance from it, 30, 40 yards away from that minion, so that they are sure that when that minion dies, that expanding circle to find the 2 closest players is going to hit someone on blue or red before it hits the 2 range that are killing the minion. So the first rotation that you can use is really good for assigning 1 solo player to handle the minions early in the fight. So if you have 1 player that's exceptionally good at minions, give them as many stacks as you can early in the fight, and they'll be able to solo those for quite a long time, allowing your extra DPS that's in that first pair to focus on the bosses. So hunters are exceptionally good at this role because they can snare every minion and do a lot of burst DPS at max range. Warlocks can be fairly good. They have to be a little more vigilant about keeping their dots up on both the boss and the minion. But they have a really good snare. The problem is eventually the minions will spawn faster than the snare cooldown. So at that point, the Warlock will need assistance on slowing the mobs. But anyway, if you find that you have a solo player that can handle minions well, this rotation will work fairly good. So in the top left, the basic idea is pretty simple. The first pair of players with that solo minion player stacks up to 6 in the initial set. So the first 6 minions they get. Then the second pair goes up to 7. Third pair goes up to 8. And then the final tank pair, with your tank in it, goes up to 9, if there's time. Now throughout this, the basic rule is that any given player that has about 30 or 25 seconds remaining on their corrupted essence stack needs to take it upon him or herself to refresh their stack manually. So when that first pair gets up to 6 and the second pair starts getting stacks, that first pair of players need to move into range of a minion when they have about 30 or 25 seconds remaining. If they do this, this will give them a gap of about 2 minion deaths to ensure that they get a refresh. So if they run in to get a refresh and a minion dies, but they don't get close enough for some reason, they should have enough time to have a second minion die before their stack fades. So try to keep that buffer for players to refresh so you're not cutting it too close. Now the second rotation here is the one that we settled on, and it definitely seems the easiest to perform, and it's probably the best for distribution of stacks. So the basic idea, if you look at the top left again, is that your 3 DPS pairs basically use a 3, 6, 8 rotation. So every pair in order goes from 0 to 3 stacks, first, second, and third, and then it repeats. Then pair 1 gets another 3 stacks going from 3 to 6, and the same thing for pairs 2 and 3. And then finally, they all go up to get 2 more stacks this time, go up to 8 total. Once the third pair has their 8th stack, then pair number 4, the tank pair, will get all the stacks from that point forward. So they'll be in the primary position, which is like the blue marker position. And then, of course, as with the rule before, once the tanks start getting their stacks, eventually players will need to refresh in the DPS pairs. So again, to refresh, simply run in to get a minion when you have about 25 or 30 seconds remaining on your current corrupted essence stack, and you'll have time for at least 2 minions to die, so you can be sure that you get a refresh. This will ensure that the single refresh after the tank pair starts getting stacks will push any DPS pair to 9, which is of course the max, and around this time the fight will be over one way or the other. So this basically means that all DPS will have 8 stacks in the final phase. Maybe a few people will have 9, and then your tanks will generally have 5 or more, by the time you're doing the third phase. So it's a great way to evenly distribute stacks effectively. There's no real gimmicks. People don't need to watch for their refreshes on their own until the very end, because the rotation takes care of it. So by the time the third pair is getting their 6th, then, next pair is ready to get, the first pair is ready to go up to 8 again, and so on. So it's really easy to manage. 1 or 2 people in the raid can watch the stacks and tell people what's going on and all that stuff. So I highly recommend you try it. It's certainly simpler than the first method, but of course the trade-off is that the first pair, specifically the ad killers, are going to have fewer stacks early in the fight. So you may need to compensate for this. The way we chose to do that is to have 2 DPS on the ads basically full time. So our Warlock and our Balanced Druid are killing ads almost the entire fight, pretty much without exception. And this seems to work okay because with the stacks distributed evenly amongst the other DPS, the damage on the bosses is not really hindered in any way. So the early damage in the first phase might be a little bit lower because you have one fewer DPS attacking the boss, but as the fight progresses, it will balance out fine. And then by the time you get to the third phase, where the damage really matters the most, it should be okay. So for the first phase, you're going to be fighting Protector Kaolan, and you can't really kill any of the other mobs first, because if you are doing a single tank method, which again I recommend strongly, then if Kaolan is alive, after an elder dies, he'll gain defiled ground, and this will force your tank to kite to get out of the pools, which of course means your positioning is screwed up and your minion positioning is difficult and all that stuff. So you have to kill Kaolan first, basically. Now, this first phase, the damage can be pretty high, especially as the phase progresses. So you really want to focus all your heavy DPS at the start. Try to get them down as fast as you can. This, of course, is also because you won't have very many stacks of Corrupted Essence from the minions at this point in the fight, since it's so early. And then finally, Kaolan has the most health of any of the mobs, so it will just take a longer time inherently. And now, Touch of Sha will be distributed around the raid every so often, increasing the damage that the raid takes as the phase progresses. So at the end, there's going to be a lot of healing going on for your healers, especially if you're two healing it. In addition, there can be quite a bit of spike damage on the tank, since you've got 3 mobs hitting them. So to alleviate this, interrupts are the name of the game. You should have 1 or 2 people focusing on interrupting lightning bolt from Regail, because that's on the tank, and that'll cause some spike damage. But by far the most important interrupt throughout the entire fight is the water bolt from Asani. We'll talk about that in detail when we get to the next phase. But even in this first phase, it's important to interrupt that because it's a short radius AE, and it can do a heavy amount of damage to a bunch of players at once. So focus on keeping the tank high on health so they don't get spiked. And then you have the normal abilities, just like in normal difficulty. So you have the heal from Cleansing Waters. This should be purged or dispelled immediately by one assigned player. There should not be any heal ticks that are allowed to go off on Kaolan. And then the other thing that's important is Lightning Prison. So, of course, this is cast on 2 random raid members. And if you're using 2 healers, it's important you have a very strict system to work out who dispels which player so that you're not allowed to have damage ticks go off. So in our case, the Paladin healer and myself have a pretty simple system worked out. I might have talked about it before, where in our groups, I start at the top left of our groups, basically the top of the list, and go down until I find someone to dispel, and he goes from the bottom of the group list and goes up to the top until he finds someone. So we never are dispelling the same player. Now, the only time there can be an issue is if both healers get Lightning Prison at the same time. If that's the case, you have to have a way to manage it. So in our case, we have our Paladin who will bubble his off, and then he can dispel me. But if it happens too frequently and he can't bubble again, then our Shadow Priest will mass dispel us. Basically, we just stay in the center and he mass dispels immediately. So it's a good idea to have some form of backup if you're using 2 healers in case that happens. Finally, if you're researching this fight, you may find many people suggest not having your melee DPS run out when they get prison. But I don't think that's a good suggestion. And the reason is pretty simple. If for any reason one of your healers doesn't dispel right away on that global and allows a tick of Lightning Prison to go off, it's going to hit everyone that's in melee range. And often that's going to be the majority of your raid. Now, by itself, that's not really deadly damage. But when that's combined with any miscellaneous damage elsewhere, like Touch of Sha ticks or a random bolt, then you can start getting in trouble. So while you can certainly stand in the middle and dispel immediately, if you're using two healers, there's a potential that one of your healers is not going to be able to dispel before a tick goes off, because if one healer gets the prison, the other healer has to dispel that healer, and then the healer that was prisoned has to wait an extra global before they can dispel the other player. And if that other player is a melee, they're going to tick on the raid. So the downside is that you lose a little bit of damage, but it's a very minor amount. You know, consider how long it takes a melee to run out, wait a global or two, get dispelled, and run back in. You know, they only have to go out a couple yards. It's not that much of a loss. So we found it's better safe than sorry in that case. But if you have three healers, it doesn't matter, so you can do that. Now, second, you'll want to be on Regail. So at this point, both Regail and Asani obviously gain an extra ability, just like normal difficulty. So you have Corrupted Waters, which spawn there in the middle, from Asani, and these should be killed immediately. Once they're about to die, make sure your DPS try their best to get inside the circle for the haste buff, because it's very beneficial. This won't always be possible, but if you can do so, try to do so. The other reason to kill it fast is obviously that the bosses gain a huge haste buff, 75%, while that is active. This means that both the lightning bolt and water bolt casts come very rapidly, and interrupts are extremely important, or people will just start dying rapidly. So this is a great way to take advantage of a focus interrupt macro. Everyone with an interrupt on this fight should be using one. So you can see the basic syntax up in the top left. You can do /casts in brackets at focus, comma, harm, comma, exists, close bracket, and then an extra open and close bracket, then a space, and then the interrupt spell name. So what this will do is if you use that ability and you have a focus target that's harmful, it will interrupt that target, that focus target. However, if you don't have a focus target, or your focus is not a harmful player, or entity, like it's a friendly, it will use the second bracket, which is just nothing. It just basically defaults to that spell on your target, which is normal. So it's a great interrupt macro to use frequently outside of even this fight. If you don't have a target or a focus target, you can still interrupt your main target, just like normal. Anyway, by setting Asani, for example, as your focus during the first and second phase when you're on Kaolan and Regail, respectively, you can still properly interrupt water bolts and whatnot. Now, the other thing that's important is to have a rotation set up for interrupting. It's unfortunate. I thought we were done with interrupt rotations in WoW, but they're back, and they're a pain in the ass. So you're going to need solid interrupts on Asani especially, and hopefully Regail as well, although it's not quite needed. So the way we handled it is we had 4 people set up in an Asani rotation to deal with water bolt. This is because if you have a normal 15-second cooldown with a 4-second lockout, the cast time between water bolts seems to be about 4.8 seconds minimum. So 4.8 times 4 obviously is over the 15-second cooldown, so you can just keep him locked out the whole time. And then extra interrupts are on Regail. So generally, as a healer, I was on Regail. With our tank, he would also get Regail during the second phase when the Corrupted Waters are active and he's spamming Lightning Bolt crazy fast. So he would get the first interrupt when Corrupted Waters are active on Regail, and then once the lockout was done, I would get a second Lightning Bolt interrupt during that Corrupted Waters, and then by that time, Storm usually hits, and the Corrupted Waters are killed until another round. And meanwhile, the 4 assigned interrupters on Asani are getting the water bolt just like normal. So, yeah, it's a pain, but practice it, set up some macros, set up some, yell or say macros to let people know it's their turn, set up weak ores, whatever you have to do so that your rotation is solid, because it's really, really important in the last phase that you don't let water bolt go off. So the other thing in this the second phase is, of course, Storm. You can see it there. It's pretty easy to deal with. It's just like the normal version. So just make sure your raid is aware that it's happening or can happen soon, and then they find a proper position to avoid it. The only thing you have to watch for is players that are meant to be getting the current minion and therefore corrupted essence stack. They should run out toward that minion location as they're dodging Storm. So, for example, if your tanks or your melee DPS are running out to avoid Storm, but they're getting their essence stacks, make sure they go toward the minion spawn location when they dodge. And that way they'll be the closest player still. But otherwise, Storm's easy. You know how to do it. So finally, when you get Regail down, you're on Asani. And this final phase is ridiculous. It's where the men and women are separated from the boys and girls. It's insane how much damage there is. You have two basic things that can kill you at any given moment if you're not doing it properly. The first is Water Bolt. If you don't interrupt those, the random damage can spike everyone and just annihilate you. Because the other thing that you're dealing with, of course, is Overwhelming Corruption. So on Heroic, this starts out at 48,000 damage per tick. And every 3 seconds, the stack increases, increasing the damage by 10% per stack. So, believe it or not, after about 25 seconds in this phase, the damage dealt to the raid from Overwhelming Corruption is higher than the damage if you were to do the elite version and fight Kaolan by himself, with all 10 players having the Touch of Fear debuff. So just very shortly into this phase, the damage is just insane from that. So this is where all the DPS comes in. You have to have everyone's stacks at proper levels. You have to be forcing everyone to interrupt those bolts, because if you let a bolt go off with a tick of Overwhelming Corruption, that's easily 400,000 or 500,000 damage, instantly. Someone can die. So you have to manage both of those well. The other main thing is that the DPS requirement is pretty severe. You're going to want to try to get this phase down in as close to a minute as possible. And at first that's going to seem insurmountable. But just keep practicing. Really, dwell on the fact that everyone needs to burn their DPS cooldowns at this moment. So everything you have available is saved for this time. The other thing is take advantage of what you can. So the corrupted water spawn that occurs just before or just after this phase begins, everyone, even your ad killers, should grab it. That extra haste is going to make a difference, even if it's only 20 seconds worth. So you really want everything you can to push this phase fast. Other than that, a few things you can do to help yourself. So healing is crazy, as I said. Obviously, mini healers have ground-based effects that are easier to heal with. So if you can ensure that water bolts are going to be interrupted, you can stack most of your raid in one position and take advantage of those AE heals that are much more efficient. Now, of course, the downside is if you miss a water bolt and it hits one of those players, you could be watching 8 people get hit by one bolt and just annihilate everybody. So again, interrupts are very important here. Otherwise, basic healing rotation stuff applies. So think of this like a crazy version of Kaolan. Your healers need to just dump everything they have into topping out everyone's health at all times, because one tick, will come at the wrong time and just finish everyone off. So save everything you have for this moment and try to keep everyone as close to full health as possible. Then start rotating cooldowns around 40 or 50%. Use health stones, personal cooldowns, everything you've got. And then when the boss is around 30% or so, both your ad DPS can just stop attacking ads completely. Because, believe it or not, the extra 10% damage dealt when a boss absorbs a minion does not increase the Overwhelming Corruption damage. So as long as the boss doesn't reach 5 stacks before they die, you can allow them to gain stacks. It will only increase the water bolt and melee damage. So around 30% or so, depending on our DPS, those 2 DPS can stop attacking and just focus on the boss and try to burn him down a little bit faster. So I think we got him down in about 75 seconds or so, and that was by far the fastest that we'd done in this phase. So we barely survived it, but yeah, it's crazy. Anyway, so I think that covers about everything on this fight. Just keep practicing phase, 1, you'll get that down eventually, then phase 2, then you'll get that, and then phase 3 ties it all together. So just do your minion positioning and rotation, and you should get it down. So good luck, and thanks for watching.